You can spot a bad property in under 60 seconds if you know what to pay for. As many of you know, I'm a real estate agent. I've walked through thousands of homes, and today I'm going to provide you with a checklist that could save you from making a big mistake and wasting a ton of money. One of the most common questions I get from first-time home buyers is asking me what they should be paying attention to when they're walking through a property. So what I'm going to do today is give you a checklist of things that I'm paying attention to as I'm walking through a property for the very first time. Remember, buyers buy emotionally and they justify logically. So my job as a real estate agent is to point out things to a buyer that they might not be thinking about. Because the last thing I want is a buyer to buy a home and then ultimately regret it because they weren't paying attention to the right things. So with that, I want you to visualize with me that we're pulling up to a property for the very first time. One of the very first things I'm looking at as I'm approaching that property is I'm looking at the street parking. Is there a lot of it? Is there barely any? Is it easy to find a parking spot? What day of the week is it? Because all of this matters. If it's the middle of the week and there's no parking at all in the middle of the day, that presents a problem because that's when most people should be at work. So that means when people get off from work, parking is going to be a huge headache if you have to park on the street. Now I know what you're saying. Well, Jeb, I have a driveway. I plan to park in the driveway, so I don't really care about the street parking. You should, because that ultimately signals to me that there's either some sort of multi-generational living in the neighborhood, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it just means there's more people occupying certain residences than there probably should be, which means there's excess cars on the street. So if you decide to have a party or have people over at some point and they need to park on the street, then that could present a problem. So I want you to pay attention to that as you're pulling up to the property. Now, as we get out of the car and we start walking towards the front door, I'm typically starting to look at the roof of the property. Now, when I'm looking at the roof, I'm trying to look at the condition of it. Now, many times it's very, very hard to figure out whether it's a newer roof or an older roof, but you're essentially looking for shiny spots on the roof because that can show deterioration. Also looking at the ridge caps along the top of the property. And then as we're getting closer, I'm trying to see if there's multiple layers on the roof. Is there one layer? Is there two layers? Because oftentimes that can signal whether or not the roof has actually ever been replaced. Now, about this time, we're approaching the front door. I'm fiddling with the lockbox, trying to get the key out, and you're looking around at the rest of the property. Well, I want you to pay attention to whether or not there's deteriorating wood outside. Are there termites? Is there any sign of neglect or deferred maintenance on the property? Is there areas of moisture intrusion in that wood that could present a problem later down the road? Now, from this point, typically we're walking through the front door and we're starting to look throughout the property. But what I want to do is I want to focus on the exterior of the property because that's where we started. So from this point forward, let's just pretend that we walked out the back door and now we're walking around the exterior of the property. What are other things that we should be paying attention to? As a real estate agent, I'm looking for cracking in the stucco, cracking in the wood, and I'm not typically worried about like hairline cracks. I'm more worried about cracks where you could fit a quarter in, where they're jagged, they're not straight, because oftentimes that could mean there's a potential issue with the foundation of that property. Now, what I'll say is a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today aren't really that common, but they're things that I'm actually looking for. In addition to that, I'm paying attention to the chimney. Is the chimney leaning? Does it have any sort of cracking in it? Because oftentimes these are the things I'm seeing called out in home inspections. It can be very, very costly to replace and or fix. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to the right things up front so that we're not falling in love and making an offer on a property that we ultimately don't want to move forward with because of all of the issues. Now, some other things I'm paying attention to when I'm walking around the exterior of that property are the fences. Are they leaning? Are they broken? Is it a block wall? Is it some sort of wood wall? Does it need to be replaced? If so, is it shared with a neighbor? Is that something that you're going to have to work out with the neighbor in order to be replaced in the future? In addition to that, how does the lawn look? Does it look like it's been taken care of? Does it look like it's been neglected? Are there sprinklers? That sort of thing in the backyard. Also, while I'm in the backyard, if I'm being honest, I'm also trying to peek into the neighbor's yard. Is the neighbor maintaining their property? What does it look like? Because not only does the neighbor's upkeep matter if you go to sell your property, it also matters because if you do have to do some sort of maintenance, that's some sort of shared expense between the two of you, somebody that cares about their property is probably more willing to work with you than someone who has neglected things for years. So ultimately, I just want to make sure that the neighbors actually care about their properties. In addition to that, I'm looking at trees. I'm looking at things that are close to the property because that might signal to me that I need further inspections on that property if I do make an offer. Instead of a typical home inspection that's just inspecting the home If there's a bunch of trees and that sort of thing around the exterior of the property, then chances are I probably also want a sewer inspection of that property, because in my experience, roots often find a way to get in the sewer lines and in the plumbing of the property. And the last thing you want to do is buy a property, have some sort of backup, if you will, the property floods, and then you have additional issues. So you just want to pay attention to these things while you're on the exterior of the property. Now, I realize I'm throwing a lot of information at you, a lot of things that you should be paying attention to, but the reality is if you have a professional real estate agent on your side, these are things that they should be pointing out, walking you through, kind of guiding you through the process. And it shouldn't feel overwhelming. It should just feel natural as they walk you through these things. Now, if you have a great real estate agent like that, congratulations. If you don't, and you'd like a real estate agent that works directly like I do me a favor and check that link in the description of the video. I'm happy to refer you to a vetted professional that works exactly like I do. In addition to that, pay attention to the electrical panel. Open it up. How many amps is that electrical panel? Is it original? Has it been replaced? If there's solar on the property, did they replace the solar? Did they replace the roof underneath that solar before installing it? Because remember, if you have to replace the roof of your property, that solar has to come off in order to do that. So you just want to pay attention to these big ticket items that could be costly down the road. Now, depending on where you're located in the country, you may or may not see a water heater on the exterior of the property. Here in California, a lot of homes have their water heaters on the exterior of the property. So if the water heater's on the exterior, if it's in the house, if it's in the garage, wherever that water heater is, you want to pay attention to it. How old is that water heater? Typically, there's a sticker right on the front of that water heater that shows you when it was manufactured. Now, just because it was manufactured in, say, 2015 doesn't necessarily mean it was installed in 2015, but at least you know how old it is. But on top of that, a lot of plumbers out there actually put the date that they installed on the water heater so you know the real date. So just take that into account as well, because remember, water heaters don't last anything like they used to. In fact, the new ones probably last somewhere between 10 and 12 years, whereas the water heaters of my parents' generation lasted 30 plus years. Now, we're almost done with the exterior of the property, but the last thing I want you to pay attention to, outside of it having a swimming pool, if it does, is I want you to pay attention to the condenser that goes with the heating and air conditioning unit. The condenser is the unit that sits on the exterior of the home that actually provides the cool air that goes through your home. What does that look like? Does it look older? Does it look newer? What kind of condition is it in? Is it clean, or does it have a bunch of debris in it? Just pay attention to how it's been maintained, because that can signal to you whether or not the homeowner is doing any sort of yearly maintenance or routine maintenance on that item. Now, as we get past the air conditioning unit, the last thing I want to talk about on the exterior of the property is if the property has a swimming pool. If the property has a swimming pool, you should be paying attention to the coping around the exterior of the pool. You should be paying attention to whether there's any cracking in the deck, as well as the pool equipment, and also the bottom texture of the pool. What kind of shape is it in? And the reason we're paying attention to these items is because they're very, very costly to replace. So we just want to make sure if we're buying a house with a swimming pool that these items are being taken care of. Now, before we go to the interior of the property, I want to take a minute here and ask a favor. If you find any value in my videos at all, make sure you hit that thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Now come back with me and visualize that we're now walking through the front door of that property. What feeling do you get? And the reason I ask that is because oftentimes I tell my clients that you shouldn't have to convince yourself it's the right house. You should walk into that property and get a feeling that it's the right home. If you're trying to convince yourself, then it probably isn't the right property. But if you're walking in and you're feeling the right emotions, then chances are you're probably in the right house. But what should you be paying attention to? Well, as we're walking to that front door, I just want you to pay attention to the maintenance of that property. Understand that properties don't have to be highly upgraded to be a good property. A property that has good bones and has been taken care of over the years can also be at the top of the list. But as you're walking through the property, I want you to keep asking yourself, do you feel like the property is being well maintained? Or does it feel like the owners just don't care about the property and they're probably letting things go? Again, you don't need a house with a ton of upgrades. You just need a house with pride of ownership, where someone actually cared about the property. When there were leaks, they got them fixed. When there were things that stopped working, they got them addressed. But with that, I want you to pay attention to the floors that you're walking on. If it's carpet, has the carpet been well maintained? If it's hardwood floors, does it have the potential to be refinished and refurbished and sanded down and restained where you want to keep it? And on top of that, as you're walking around, I want you to see if you feel any sloping in the flooring, any soft spots in the flooring, that sort of thing. Now, with laminate flooring and vinyl flooring, that sort of thing, you can often get soft spots in the floor. It's pretty normal for that type of flooring. But if there's any sort of hardwood in the flooring or tile or that sort of thing, and you're getting soft spots or you're getting any sort of major sloping in the floor, that's definitely something to pay attention to, because that often signals that there's probably some issue with the foundation. Now, in my experience, houses on slab foundations typically have less of this sloping effect than houses on raised foundation, especially older homes that are on raised foundations. You can often get some sloping in different areas of the property. And that's one of the reasons that I carry a golf ball around with me in a car, because sometimes I'll put it on the floor just to see if it rolls in a certain direction if I'm feeling that the floor is uneven. Now, as we're continuing to walk through the property, we're paying attention to the windows. Have the windows been replaced? Are they starting to fog in areas where windows have actually been replaced? Oftentimes the windows have been replaced, but in some cases the gas has leaked out of those windows and now they're starting to fog. So this is something we want to pay attention to, because this can often mean if we move in and buy this property, that's something that we're going to have to address down the road if the seller doesn't address it through our offer. So either way, we just want to make sure that the seals haven't failed on those windows. I'm also opening cabinets underneath sinks to see if there's any sort of water leaking, or has there been previous leaks maybe that weren't addressed in a timely manner and now there's mold or deteriorated wood underneath that sink. Because you'd actually be surprised how often we see mold and rot underneath sinks, and that ultimately signals a huge red flag. Now, while I'm opening up the sinks, I'm also opening up closets. I'm looking in different spaces. I'm looking to see what the furnace looks like. Is it original? Has it been replaced? And the reason I'm paying attention to these items is because they're costly to replace, right? As a homeowner, the last thing you want to do is buy an expensive house and come in and have to replace all of these expensive items. So as a real estate agent, what I'm trying to do is protect your investment on the buyer side, right? We're looking at the items that are going to cost you the most money when you're buying that home. Things like the roof, things like electrical, plumbing, water heater, HVAC. And in some cases, it's going to be very, very hard to get a property that has all of them brand new. So that's not the ultimate goal here. The goal here is just to know what we're getting ourselves into so that we have proper expectations if we decide to put an offer in on that home. Now, the next thing I want to pay attention to on the exterior of the property is if the property has been remodeled, especially if it's a flip. But more importantly, if the property's been updated over time, especially any sort of, conversions or additions to that property. I'm trying to see if they've been done in a workmanlike manner, right? Have they been done by a qualified contractor? Now, oftentimes, some of these things were done prior to the previous sellers actually owning that property. So they don't actually have all of the details of that home. So what we're trying to do is just walk through if we see any obvious signs of deferred maintenance, any sort of neglect, to see if, we think that maybe it was done by somebody that was unqualified at the time to do those repairs or upgrades. While we're discussing additions and that sort of thing, I think it's important to understand that when you're buying a home, there are certain disclosures that the seller is required to provide when you're buying a property, and it goes over things like room additions and upgrades and that sort of thing without permits, and you need to pay attention to that. But even when those have been done with permits, you still just want to make sure that you're comfortable with the construction that was completed, especially when a property has been flipped, because again, most buyers buy emotionally and they justify logically. So when they walk into a property that's been nicely upgraded where everything is new, they tend to overlook the details. So if the property has been upgraded, just make sure you're paying attention to the details. What does the caulking look like? Are the cabinets actually aligned properly? Are there gaps between things? How does the flooring look? You need to be paying attention to everything, because I can't tell you how often I see flip jobs that are so poorly done, and then I walk in with a buyer and they're just in love with the property, and then I start to point out some of these things and they go, Jeb, I didn't even see any of that. I didn't notice that. It's because you're caught up in the big picture, whereas I'm more focused on the detail. So if you plan on making an offer on a property, do me a favor. As a real estate agent, do not waive your home inspection when going through the home buying process. I understand that some markets out there are competitive. It's very, very difficult to get your offer accepted. But with that, you should never buy a home without doing the proper due diligence up front, because if you do, chances are you're going to have huge regrets. On top of that, as a buyer, it's okay to ask a lot of questions. If your agent doesn't know the answers to them, they can try to go to the selling side to see if they have the answers to those questions. If they don't have the answers, then you can go to the city to see if the city has the answers. But either way, as a buyer, it's okay to ask questions about a property and things that you're concerned with. In addition to that, I want you to drive by the home during the day, during the night, on the weekends, at different times. Don't always look at the property the same days of the week, the same times, because chances are you're always going to see the same things. So you need to change when you're viewing that property just so you see it in all of its glory. Remember, it's not about finding a perfect home, it's about avoiding a money trap. Now with that, I want you to let me know what red flags you've seen in homes. Do me a favor and drop it in the comments.